Most of us who grew up in the United States learned about the Lewis and Clark expedition, which took place between 1803 and 1806. Their group comprised a number of different individuals and animals, but did you know that among their ranks was a remarkable Newfoundland retriever named Seaman? Hi, and welcome to Footnoting History. I'm Ben DiBiase. On this episode, we'll talk about one of America's most famous four-legged explorers and trace his remarkable journey across the American continent and learn about the relationship between humans and working dogs on the American frontier in the early years of the Republic. Before we get into the experiences of Seaman the dog, let's talk about the expedition and the context which this dog found itself in 1803. The Lewis and Clark expedition, formerly known as the Corps of Discovery Expedition, was a U.S. government-sponsored endeavor to explore, map, and claim vast portions of the American continent west of the Mississippi River for the American government, following the acquisition of the region through the Louisiana Purchase from the First French Republic in 1803. The Louisiana Purchase, as a legal framework, remains of course a much more complicated and nuanced international legal agreement, including the very real argument against the constitutionality of the purchase, as well as domestic disapproval. But the crux of the deal, in the eyes of its proponents, sought to solidify America's imperial claim on vast stretches of the North American continent, thus providing provisional rights with other colonial powers to negotiate its own treaties with indigenous tribes, establish their own settlements, and ultimately pave the way for broader expansion. It's within this context, it's imperative to discuss the fact that the North American continent was, and had been for millennia, already occupied by tens of thousands of human inhabitants comprising a complex network of various tribal governments, engaging in their own cultural practices, negotiating their own trade and boundary agreements with other tribes, Euro-American traders, as well as other European entities including France and England. They'd existed within this space long before the newly formed American government decided to send a small group of volunteers across a vast expanse of territory about which they understood very little. In fact, one of the primary goals of the expedition was just that, to initiate conferences with various tribes in advance of land cession initiatives. For the Americans, the stakes for the Corps of Discovery Expedition endeavor were very real and very high. U.S. President Thomas Jefferson understood that after emerging from the American Revolution, the balance of colonial power in North America was highly contested, and that the need to establish land cessions and trade agreements with various tribes that occupied these areas, land cessions that were unevenly beneficial to American interests, was of the utmost importance to his government. Creating these political ties and physically mapping their route as an exercise in reconnaissance were the mission's primary goals. However, Jefferson and the Corps' planners also understood that there was an opportunity to conduct scientific experiments. Both Lewis and Clark, as well as other members of the party, collected weather data, as well as information and samples of various flora and fauna. For members of the Corps, the expedition offered an opportunity for very real hardship, probable failure, potential fame and future opportunities, but above all, adventure. The Corps itself comprised an interesting collection of persons, beginning of course with the expedition leaders, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, but it also included a Shoshone guide and interpreter named Sacagawea, her son Jean-Baptiste, also York, an African-American who was enslaved to William Clark. Although the total number is debated, most scholars of the expedition believe that the Corps at its height comprised some 45 to 47 individuals. They were a mix of both civilians and U.S. Army personnel, backwoodsmen from Kentucky and Tennessee, French traders and boatsmen, as well as hunters and interpreters. Most were officially hired onto the expedition as soldiers. Setting aside the geopolitical significance of the expedition to the eventual Euro-American settlement of Western North America, the sheer scale and scope of the project at that time was substantial. Over time, the expedition has been interpreted in a myriad of ways, ranging from it being a central tenet in America's fabled, destined Western expansion and dominance narratives, made famous by historians like Frederick Jackson Turner at the turn of the 20th century, to a story of impending environmental and societal disaster for indigenous people and wildlife within these areas. Yet for the members of the expedition, and for one dog, all of that was likely far outside of their worldviews. While they understood the expedition was important, they likely focused more on the day-to-day experience, choreographed with military-level planning and routine. To put it another way, they were just putting one paw in front of the other. What we know about the expedition, and about Seaman the dog today, and what generations of historians and researchers have pored over ever since, are the numerous individual journals kept by members of the party. These have become the primary sources for understanding the multi-year expedition and the events immediately afterwards. The story of the various journals and their publishing is complicated. Having no one official scribe, Lewis and Clark relied on their combined notes, as well as those of other members of their party. Upon returning in 1806, the journals had to first be organized, then transcribed, a task which Lewis especially found challenging. Later issues regarding actual publishing delayed the appearance of the first journals in print until 1814. The earliest publication included errors in transcription and removed some major scientific discussions. But most importantly, in 1814, the initial publication did not mention Seaman the dog at all. It was not until almost a century later, when the full journals were discovered and transcribed, that Seaman made his debut to a wider audience. However, even in that 1904 republishing, the name of the dog was thought to be Scannon. It would take another almost century before the name Seaman was attached to the Newfoundland. Seaman the dog likely started its life in or around the settlement of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the first years of the 19th century. Although little is known about the dog's actual origins, we do know it was purchased by Meriwether Lewis for the expedition for the high sum of $20, as he made additional preparations while in Pittsburgh. Those preparations included the purchasing and outfitting of a keelboat that would eventually carry the group most of the way west, as well as securing additional provisions and personnel in the summer of 1803. The settlement, which had formed around Fort Pitt in the late 18th century, later becoming the town of Pittsburgh in the 1790s, had already established itself as an important staging point for settlers moving west into the Ohio Valley. Located at the headwaters of the Ohio River and boasting just over 1,500 inhabitants in 1800, the town quickly became an important boat-building center. Because of its significance as a staging point for settlers and pioneers, it's likely that dog breeding for use as working dogs and companions for these riverine expeditions was quite common and probably already established. Therefore, Lewis was likely aware of the breed's capabilities before the purchase and of the potential for acquiring a Newfoundland while in Pittsburgh. Newfoundlands are a relatively large modern dog breed, averaging between 100 and 150 pounds and standing over 2 feet tall when fully grown. The breed has a long history as a working dog on ships and along waterfronts in the Canadian Maritime provinces, as the name suggests, and are able swimmers from birth, having partially webbed toes. They're even capable of pulling heavy weight, such as a drowning person, while swimming. Aside from its strength, the breed was also known for its genial personality, famously praised by none other than Lord Byron himself, who actually had a monument erected in Newstead Abbey for his beloved Newfoundland named Boatswain, who interestingly was a contemporary of Seaman. When Meriwether Lewis purchased his Newfie in Pittsburgh in that summer of 1803, it's very likely that he chose the breed deliberately, seeking those same qualities and naming it according to its rank and position within the party, an able-bodied seaman. An interesting mystery surrounds what Lewis's famous expedition dog actually looked like. Some of the first artistic interpretations of Seaman depict it as having an entirely black coat. However, scholars and at least one art historian who have studied the appearance of Newfoundlands in 18th century artwork have argued that the all-black variant of the Newfoundland likely did not become prevalent among the breed until much later, and that Lewis's Newfie most likely had a white coat with patches of black or flecks of other dark and tawny colors in its coat, creating a more ruddy mix of browns and white. So what was life like for a dog bred and purchased in 1803 for a life alongside a settler and military expedition? The short answer, sadly, is, well, short. It's likely not surprising that dogs were bred and utilized as workers, more for their capabilities than personalities. They accompanied settlers into the Western territories, serving as guards, herders, hunters, and yes, companions. However, they generally had a role to play within a larger system, whether that be within a pioneer family or a military expedition. Like horses and mules or other beasts of burden, dogs were necessary means to accomplish ends, however harsh that can be to accept today. Their lives were dictated by the cruelty, compassion, or circumstances of their masters, and were too often cut short while carrying out their duties. The job of the frontier dog was to ward off predators, protect other domestic animals, pull sleds, and perform numerous other physically and cognitively demanding duties. Sometimes the animals were even killed and eaten when provisions ran low, or the hunting proved poor. Written accounts, early North American expeditions are rife with accounts of dogs being slaughtered and consumed as a last resort to stave off starvation. In fact, it regularly occurred during this very expedition. Suffice it to say, when Seaman joined the Corps of Discovery in 1803, history showed that his chances of survival were tragically low. There's a growing body of scholarship that examines the history of the relationship between canines and humans. The lens of a symbiotic, albeit sometimes imbalanced, assistance and reliance relationship is commonly applied to the study of human-canine dynamics. New archaeological evidence points to humans and dogs cohabitating and cooperating as early as 12,000 years ago in the Americas, and much earlier in other parts of the world. We know from early historical accounts by Europeans that indigenous groups in the Americas utilized pre-contact dogs for very similar purposes, hunting, protection, companionship, etc. But that some groups also integrated dogs into more complex cultural belief systems, and likely considered them as part of the community. With all that in mind, it's likely that Seaman's presence alongside the Corps of Discovery expedition wouldn't have seemed out of place or caused much of a stir, other than his size relative to other dogs in the Americas at the time, whenever the party entered various indigenous communities along their journey. Getting back to the expedition, we know that Seaman accompanied Lewis when he left Pittsburgh in August 1803, heading along the Ohio River towards present-day Missouri over the course of the following months. William Clark and several other members then joined the party, and the entire group soon began their ascent of the Missouri River and general movement westward. The first mention of Seaman in the various journals occurs while the party was traveling the Ohio River on September 11, 1803, when Lewis recounts Seaman diving into the water after a group of squirrels who were crossing the river, catching several for their dinner. Lewis writes, quote, "My dog was one of the Newfoundland breed, very active, strong, and docile. He would take the squirrels in the water, kill them, and swimming, bring them in his mouth to the boat." End quote. An entry on September 14th of that same year describes another encounter of migrating squirrels, all caught by Seaman while the boat crew continued on the river. It's difficult to imagine the scene today. A giant Newfoundland diving into the Ohio River after a migrating group of thousands of gray squirrels. His actions must have impressed, or at the very least, amused Lewis and the party at the time. On some accounts, Seaman is mentioned in the journals by other Corps members, including Sergeant John Ordway, a native of New Hampshire who joined the company from the U.S. Army's 1st Infantry and who kept the most copious notes throughout the expedition. William Clark also mentions Seaman several times, including a brief anecdote from July 5, 1804, in which he describes Seaman driving out a group of beavers from their dam on the Missouri River, upon which the party set up a camp and ate their dinner that night. Later that same year, Seaman was severely injured from the bite of a wounded beaver, and as a result, there are no more accounts of him attacking their dens. Despite the mishap, Seaman appears to have been a very active hunting dog, as there are several mentions of his attempts to collect game for the party, both successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully. In an entry by Ordway from July 14, 1804, he describes the party attempting to down 3 elk, only to have them pursued by Seaman into the woods and eventually lost. On May 8, 1806, Ordway again mentions Seaman and relates that he chased a wounded deer into the woods while the party was out hunting, eventually tracking and taking down the animal. There are also several brief mentions of Seaman taking down pronghorns throughout their journey. Earlier in the expedition, while still traversing the Ohio River near its confluence with the Mississippi, Lewis penned the most detailed information about his dog throughout the entire journal. It was on November 16, 1803, that the party met members of the Delaware tribe, as well as a group of Shawnee tribal members encamped at that location. After meeting and exchanging goods, one of the Shawnees offered Lewis 3 beaver skins for his dog, but Lewis writes that there was no negotiation, for he had purchased Seaman for $20 explicitly for the expedition, and although fine furs, he noted that the Newfoundland breed was one that he, quote, prized much for his docility and qualifications generally, unquote, thus keeping Seaman on with the crew. Although Seaman is mentioned only occasionally and sporadically throughout the journals, the timing and nature of his appearance is interesting. For example, William Clark describes a meeting with a group from the Shoshone tribe in present-day Montana, which occurred on August 17, 1805. And interestingly, he mentions that they were fascinated by their appearance and by the, quote, sagacity of Lewis's dog, unquote, a peculiar adjective for a dog, but when taken within the context of Seaman's apparent abilities up to that point, it might be one of the most telling descriptions of the dog across all of the accounts. It also tells of their special bond with Seaman by this point. A rather significant event in which Seaman figured prominently occurred during the night of May 29, 1805, while the company was camped in present-day Montana. A large bison, which could easily weigh over 2,000 pounds, had accidentally stepped into one of their small boats near the shoreline. Then, after becoming startled, ran at full speed toward the camp, narrowly missing several sleeping members of the party. After circling a second time, Seaman bolted directly towards the frightened bison, driving it away from the camp while the party awoke. Lewis was most pleased with his dog's actions, and was relieved that no one in the party was injured. Soon after, while the group was camped at the aptly named White Bear Islands above the Great Falls of the Missouri, also in present-day Montana, in June 1805, they encountered an alarming number of grizzly bears in the vicinity, and from their journals, Seaman was kept in an almost constant state of alarm, as Lewis recounted during one instance during the night of July 17, 1805, when a bear entered their camp and consumed a portion of dressed bison meat. Lewis wrote that, quote, "My dog seems to be in a constant state of alarm with these bears and keeps barking all night," unquote. There is no telling how many near misses the party never knew due to Seaman's vigilance during this period. Another noted event transpired while the party was descending the Columbia River on their return trip to the Missouri River in the spring of 1806. Seaman was reportedly stolen by a local tribe, and Lewis was so upset he dispatched a group of 3 soldiers to find the dog and demand its return, even going so far as to instruct the men to shoot, if necessary, in order to get his dog back. Fortunately, no shots were fired, and Seaman was returned to the party without violence, unharmed. As mentioned earlier, throughout the expedition, and especially during the overwinter at Fort Clatsop in present-day Oregon, members of the party bought and ate several hundred dogs when stores of meat were low. However, Lewis's dog was never mentioned as a possible candidate for such a fate. There was little to no mention of Seaman's daily activities, save for passages of bravery or hunting prowess, leaving contemporary readers with a significant gap in our understanding of his life. However, given Lewis's early descriptions and refusal to sell his prized dog, it points to a deeper appreciation and perhaps dependent relationship between Lewis and his Newfoundland. After July 1806, there are no further mentions of Seaman. However, more recent information and the assumption that if he had in fact perished, at least one of the Corps' journalists would have likely chronicled the event, given that less conspicuous anecdotes about Seaman did manage to make it into their journals. Given the nature of the expedition and the number of instances in which Seaman pursued prey, tangled with bison and bears, and became involved in other extremely dangerous situations, it's remarkable that he managed to survive the entire length of the journey. Dodging snake bites, bison horns, bears, being stolen or injured in skirmishes, or simply being swept away in one of the many major North American river systems that the party traveled upon, Seaman the Newfie defied the odds and likely lived his days in relative quiet, giving his adventurous life up to that point. After the Corps had returned to St. Louis, contemporary researchers believe that Seaman stayed with Lewis, likely outliving his master, who had died in 1809. Although essentially unknown for much of the 19th century, Seaman has become one of the most recognizable members of the Corps of Expedition party. There are dozens of statues and depictions of Lewis's companion making his way across the continent. There is even a tributary of the Blackfoot River in Montana, which is believed to have been named for Seaman. Scholars continue to piece together the scant documentary trail of this Newfoundland's remarkable life. Seaman's story presents us with many interesting questions, like, how is our understanding of the dog and human relationship in early American history changing how we see the early decades of the Republic and the expansion of the American influence in North America? Should we be giving more credit to the beasts of burden who accompanied these explorers, surveyors, and early settlers? And how do we understand our own contemporary relationships with our four-legged friends? Seaman's story is one of remarkable endurance and no small amount of luck, and as historians, this historical footnote provides us with a more complete picture of the complex fabric of events, people, and animals that have shaped our shared past. Thank you for joining me for the story of Seaman the Newfoundland. Don't forget to head over to footnotinghistory.com for further reading suggestions related to everything we discussed today. We're glad you're here, and remember, the best stories are always in the footnotes.